Hi again, my name is Manuel Trute,
And I'm David Rodríguez.
and here we are again in Café Interoceana, sharing a couple of new concepts. David, we were talking about streets. Tell us a little bit more about the concept.
Well, Manuel, do you know that actually when we talk about urban design for cities, you need to actually design streets, much like you would design a hallway, a living room, and the different spaces of an architecture building.
Wow. So we have buildings, we have streets, and we have to design streets as if it was architecture.
It is very important. This is what makes the connection between the buildings and the city. This is what allows people to go from one place to another and create a diversity.
Okay, and has it always been that way throughout history, let's say?
Well, throughout history, if you talk about street design and if you do a survey, there's over 1,000 street sections throughout the world.
Wow.
You know, and actually, my friend Victor Dober wrote this book on street design, which documents a lot of these streets, which is something that is very beautiful to follow and very informative. And so the important thing about street design is that you have to understand that streets are not just for moving cars. It's the place where actually the city connects. It's the veins that make the cities livable. Our problem in the 20th century is that we've treated it as a place for only moving cars and traffic.
Exactly. So there is a question. We are now trying to go back to walkable cities. Why do we have to pay attention to people walking in the streets now in our cities?
Well, there's a lot of mention about walkability. There's walkability scores, pedestrians and connections. And it is very important in street design. The reason I say this is because when you design streets just for cars, that's all you will get is more cars. In terms of connections, of how people go from one place to another, when you talk about the carbon footprint of what all this entails. But when you design streets for cars, bikes, pedestrians, in different forms of mobility, what you get is a diversity of connection that enriches the city. That way you can get people slow moving traffic and people that connect with the shops, with the trees, with all the different spaces, as well as moving traffic as you can. And this is what you see in great spaces like Barcelona, Paris, and even in Casco Viejo.
Exactly. So you are talking about an equation. We have city, we have mobility. On the other side, we have streets with cars. Now for pedestrians, that we
Yes.
should improve the mobility, the pedestrian mobility. And then you mentioned bikes. Tell us about bikes in the equation of mobility.
Well, it's very interesting because in the 21st century, we've gone back to something of a new novelty that already existed at the end of the 19th century, which is bicycles. It's a mechanical means of mobility with a low carbon footprint. It is very flexible for people to move in bikes. Most of the more sustainable urban centers in the world now incorporate biking as a means of mobility. Again, because pedestrians are one end of the gamma for mobility and connections in the city,
Okay.
and the car is on the other end of the spectrum, bicycle gives you sort of a midway point when you design streets that allows you to make these negotiations in terms of what is the ideal street section and street design that accommodates modern needs of maybe larger scale programs in architecture, but also the connections that you need to make a sustainable neighborhood.
Okay, but Interoceanic region is in Panama, right?
Yes.
And how do we design streets in Panama? Is it included in designing buildings or designing cities in Panama?
Well, let's go back first to what we have in Panama. The challenge is that after I've talked about all this richness of street design, in Panama we have about 5 street sections that regulate actually the entire country. They're mostly oriented towards solving the traffic problem and not necessarily focusing on the connections of bikes or pedestrians in them.
Okay.
So You know, the most of the streets that have been designed in the last 20 years in Panama have very little richness to add to the connections. So that is one of the key items that we'll be talking in Interoceana. You know, what is the process to go through street design? You know, how do traffic engineers that understand this, how do they balance the need to solve for the car and the need to add richness in terms of mobility, both pedestrian and bicycles? You know, we'll see how we can visualize that. As you can see here, you'll see an example of what we're talking about. This is in downtown Kendall. This was for a charrette that we did a couple decades ago, actually. This was a while back. Okay. You know, the first things that you do is you study first the area for what is street grid, which is also important, and we'll talk about that in another session. But we talk about that to understand what are the appropriate street sections or street designs in terms of length, you know, amount of traffic, diversity that you want to apply to a place. As you can see here, you see a street that, as we talked about, is very car-oriented, just about moving cars from one place to another. But that can be redesigned in the future. And when we talk about urban design and urban planning, you know, when we talk about adding public transportation, that's another layer, not just about moving cars, but moving pedestrians. But the minute you talk about urban transportation, public transportation, now you have to talk about how do people connect to get to those places. You know, in Panama we just incorporated a metro, but you know, it's like, why did the chicken cross the street kind of kind of motion of trying to get just to the metro station because of the cars. So, you know, when you add that, maybe medians can be something that helps visualize, making it more friendly for people. Okay. Of course, shading, because Panama is a very hot place. You know, you have to factor in not just trying to get around cars, but also make it friendly for people to go through these street sections, you know. Then architecture, where it is placed and how it works and how it ties is also an important part of the street design, you know. Arcades, shaded areas, large-scale sidewalks, having the parking somewhere else that is not in the front where people interact is very important, such that you end up designing streets that are very likable to people. This is very important. You know, in the illustration that you see there, you see how you can visualize yourself walking through these streets, going from one place to another, using public transportation, shopping, you know, getting better interaction from the city. And when you look about that, even though that's a visualization, it also makes it makes look the original picture something as a fantasy and not the real world.
Great. So in Panama we have 5 sections. We need 995 extra sections, right?
I don't know if 995, but at the very least we need to study and be able to propose new ones. And I think that's something that we can do in Interoceana and we can share with the community in Panama.
So I have the feeling that I'm talking to a street design expert in Panama. So we will have the chance to listen to David in Interoceana program. So we hope to have you here. It was great to see you again. Cheers.
You know, cheers. Don't miss out. You have to come.
All right.